Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle Constable. I am CT Mirror's Manager of Membership and Audience Development. I'm very excited to welcome you to our 2020 election preview event. We've got an awesome lineup tonight, and it should be a fun discussion about a very, very critical time, a critical juncture in this country's history. But first, let me begin by saying this. Thank you. Without the financial support that everyone here tonight has provided by being a CT Mirror member, we wouldn't be here. Not just talking about this event, I'm talking about CT Mirror as a whole. The vast majority of our funding comes from individual donors just like you. So thank you very much for everything you do to help make this possible. And let's go ahead and get this thing started. John?
Thanks so much, Kyle. I was just taking a selfie so I could make sure I commemorated this moment. Thanks for stopping by for this election preview special. I don't know about you. I'm mostly excited about this because it means that the election is almost here, which means it's almost over. I want to first thank our sponsor, the League of Women Voters. I've done a lot of events with the League over the years, moderated debates and done panel discussions. And as we mark the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, I want to salute the League for their exceptional bipartisan work on behalf of voting rights. And thank you for supporting our program tonight and everything that we do here at the Mirror. We're doing more and more of these events all the time here at the Connecticut Mirror, and the best way to find out about them is to subscribe to our newsletters. Go to ctmirror.org and sign up if you haven't already. While you're there, please subscribe to our podcast, Steady Habits. Each week, we take a look at a different facet of life in the land of steady habits, and this week we have a story of how Connecticut's theater industry is struggling through the COVID pandemic. Hope you can listen in. It's really interesting. Our next event is coming up next week, and I encourage you to sign up, especially if you care about the future of journalism. Jennifer McFadden of Yale School of Management will be moderating a conversation with John Thornton of the American Journalism Project. It's on Wednesday, October 28th at 5:30 p.m. Thornton's going to be talking about how local journalism is being reimagined, why he's raised $50 million to invest in local journalism. That's a lot for local journalism. And why the American Journalism Project gave a whole bunch of money to the Connecticut Mirror last December. So it's going to be really interesting, and I hope you can join us for that conversation. Yeah, Paz is excited about that. On to tonight's conversation. Joining me are three friends who I've spent plenty of time talking to on and off the radio, and they're bringing a wide variety of perspectives, and they're also all a lot of fun. Khalilah Brown-Dean is Associate Professor of Political Science at Quinnipiac University. She's got a really important new book called Identity Politics in the United States. And she has a brand new, very cool podcast called Disrupted on Connecticut Public, which you can also download anywhere you get your podcasts. Hello there, Professor. How are you?
It's good to see you, my friend.
It's good to see you too, and good to be back doing these things with you here. Also want to welcome in Liz Kurantowicz. She's a veteran Republican strategist. As we'll discuss, she is currently working on a political action committee called Fight for Connecticut, and she's a regular on WTNH's Capitol Report. Liz, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Mark Pazniokas is the Connecticut Mirror's Capitol Bureau Chief. He's a brand new grandpa, and he is glad that he's here instead of watching Mookie Betts hit home runs for the Los Angeles Dodgers. Welcome, Paz.
Thank you, and I do not begrudge Mookie his success.
No one can begrudge Mookie his success, but we can cry for Red Sox fans. If you have questions for our panel, you can submit them in the Q&A field. You'll see them at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to some of them throughout the hour. We're also taping this conversation for broadcast or podcast on Steady Habits. So let's go around first. There's a lot of issues to talk about. The election is coming up, but the election, I think, means something different to everybody. And Khalilah, I'll start with you. Right now, a couple weeks before the election, what does this election mean to you?
Wow, what a place to start. I think this election is really about determining the health, the strength, and the function of American democracy. To see people waiting in line for 3-4 hours in places like North Carolina, to see people in Harris County, Texas, trying to get access to one drop-off box for early voting, and still hearing all of the conversations about the right to vote, what it means, what it doesn't mean. This is really about that future of understanding that in this country right now, in the middle of two pandemics, being COVID-19 and also the racial reckoning, what is the role of every person in this country in promoting democracy? And what I think is so important, John, 2 weeks out from the end of at least the voting period, not knowing who the winner will be, is that this is really a conversation that has to happen across partisan lines and across ideological orientation.
And I want to get back to that in just a little bit, because obviously that's an important conversation. We can all agree that that conversation needs to happen, and so far it doesn't seem like it's happened too much. Liz, I will turn to you. I mean, right now, what do you think that this election means?
I would agree with the professor. I think that the health of our nation's democracy is in the participation of the voting public. And I think what we're seeing in terms of people getting out to vote, using every opportunity to participate in the process, standing in line to early vote, voting by mail in places where that is allowed, utilizing absentee ballots. I think the call to action across the spectrum for people participating in the process and getting out and voting is really important. And I think you've seen, remember, one of the things that hangs in the balance here across the country is redistricting. And you've seen nationally a real move towards focus on legislative races in places where the balance of power is up for grabs. Just recently, there's been, I think it was $12 million put into Texas state house races just in the last week to try and flip some of those seats from Republican to Democrat. So I think that the attention to down ballot races and almost this bottom up approach to voter turnout is good. And I hope we see that here in Connecticut as well, where you really see this bottom up approach to the way that we participate in this process, because all politics are local.
That's something else I want to get to too, because while there's that bottom up approach and that need for it, you see so much attention still going to the top of the presidential ticket, which of course we'll get to as well. Paz, before we turn to some of those questions, how about you? What are you hearing from people, and what are you thinking about this election a couple of weeks out?
Well, I find this to be the most challenging election I've ever covered. And it's challenging in part because one of the toughest things for a reporter is recognizing cultural shifts in the moment. And I think, Liz and Khalilah can identify with that as well. That's kind of, sometimes you think you see it, you think you feel it, and then a little time goes by and you find out, no, that wasn't quite it. It was just indigestion. Trends in politics don't last the way they once did. I can recall when the U.S. House of Representatives finally went Republican, and after decades and decades, and this felt like a permanent realignment in American politics, and it wasn't. And then when the Democrats regained the House, you thought, wow, this is another significant realignment. Well, it wasn't. So we're 10 minutes into this and nobody has mentioned Donald J. Trump. So I guess I will.
You had to do it.
We'll do so. But
Thanks, Paz.
That's what we're all assessing, is what is the Trump factor? How much of what we're seeing swirls around him and is generated by him, and how much of that is just symptomatic of something else? The professor talked about, the racial reckoning prompted by some very high profile incidents, obviously George Floyd, but it feeds into what the president has been saying and tweeting. And, assessing that in the moment is not always the easiest thing for journalists. So again, my struggle is trying to separate out this moment from what is longer term and what really reflects changes in our culture and in our politics.
Well, I'm wondering, Khalilah, if you can pick up on that, though, this idea that we seem to be at this reckoning point, and so much of it does focus around Donald Trump, the space he has created for some of the divisions that we all know about in our country. But it's also fair to say that almost everything that you talked about in your opening statement, things that Liz talked about, things that Paz talked about, the real systematic problems in America, I mean, they predate Donald Trump pretty significantly. And if he goes away after this election, those things aren't necessarily magically going to fix themselves. I mean, how do you see that as we have an election that is so consumed by this Trump factor, but at the same time, it's dealing with issues that are frankly much bigger than even this man in the White House?
You know, I feel about this election the way I did about the election of Barack Obama in 2008. There was no possibility that electing Barack Obama would enter us into this post-racial era the way that some people said. You cannot erase 200 years of political development with one election or one candidate. And there's a reason that Donald Trump became president. There is a reason why you hear people saying how much they still support him and being willing to risk their own health to go to a rally without mask. And that is about a belief system, that is about concerns about the country, concerns about the rule of government that surpass Donald Trump. And so the conversation that I've been having with my students is whatever happens on election day, right? People need to have a vote plan. But what is the post-election plan? What does it mean that you can have an organized militia threaten to kidnap the governor in a state because they don't like an executive order? And so that is bigger than any one person. It's bigger than any one candidate or party. And I think that if people hang all of their hopes on one candidate, again, whatever your candidate of choice, whoever that is, if you hang all of your hopes on that one person, and you hang the future of democracy and the meaning of democracy on one person, then we have failed to really address the scope of the challenges that we face in this country.
Liz, this idea of finding common ground on things that should be obvious common ground for people maybe is one way to get at some of what we're talking about here. The idea that militias that threaten to kidnap the governor of a state is in some ways a political conversation that we should have, or that mask wearing is a political conversation that we have, seem to many people to be utterly ridiculous. They're just frankly things that are settled and that most people are going to agree on. Can we find some common ground around just basic ways in which we want to act in society? And is that a starting point for a bigger, better political conversation?
I would hope so. I mean, I would hope these are all things that we can agree on, right? I mean, my idea of politics has always been under the guise that we disagree on how to get to the solution, not on what the problems are, right? You know, that usually is based off of things that are a little bit easier to tackle from a partisan perspective, but there's nothing partisan per se about the things the professor brings up, in my view. I think mask wearing doesn't have to be partisan. It shouldn't be partisan. I think disagreeing with or rebuking a militia trying to kidnap an elected official, these are all things that I don't hear much disagreement on among Republicans I talk to, not here in Connecticut or elsewhere. So to me, these are not political posturing points that I come in contact with. And I think,
yeah, but I wonder though. I mean, there is this chunk of the American electorate which clearly is very much in support of some of the actions and the language of Donald Trump. And it's not a small number of people. It may not be the Republicans that you talk to in Connecticut, or probably the Republicans you talk to nationwide, but it's a fairly substantial number of people in the country.
Well, it's interesting because I've had this conversation with colleagues going back now 4 or 5 years of how did we end up in this situation? And I think that there's been a movement in the way that politics addresses issues. And I think, frankly, the Democrat and the Republican parties, from an establishment perspective, have missed that opportunity to be a part of that conversation. And you see, I think that created a lane for Donald Trump in a way that, while the traditional candidates were talking about issues and solutions and finding common ground and on things, the president was talking about things that were much more emotionally resonant with people. And that drove people out that were not traditional Republican voters. So that, in effect, sort of changed the way the party communicated. And I think is interesting. You see some of that on the Democrat side with Bernie Sanders, right? There's that sort of that vein of emotional resonance that establishment candidates had not been able to tap, and that we saw play out. So I'm interested to see how the electorate responds in a general election, particularly in these swing states that get so much attention, and how that changes outcomes, if at all. Were Democrats able to go out and communicate with Trump voters to say, you did not get the deliverables that you were promised, and so you need to take a different approach? That will be interesting to me. We're not getting that here in Connecticut. We're not getting swing state attention. We probably never will. But so that's in a presidential election. That's, I think, will be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Mark, you've been talking to a lot of Republicans, both these down ballot Republicans who are running for office, but also Republicans who may support them. And, you know, you just wrote a piece about this in the Mirror that suggests not all these folks really necessarily want to see their lawn sign next to a Donald Trump lawn sign as they drive through town.
No, they don't. And Republicans in the Northeast are in a tough spot. There's somebody like Paul Formica, who is a state senator, Republican state senator in Essex. East Lyme. And he is a former first selectman. They tend to be very practical folks. And, you know, he's not a Trump guy, but he's a Republican. And the criticism he gets on his Facebook page, you know, there was one day, literally, there was a comment that said, "Why don't you denounce the president?" And the next comment was, "Why don't you have a lawn sign for the president on your lawn?" And that's sort of the dilemma that Republicans in this area have. If they do publicly break with the president, they're going to lose a significant part of the base that is loyal to the president. I live in West Hartford, where there's a candidate who is a Republican candidate who's had some interesting Facebook video ads. And he's tried to create some space between him and the president and Connecticut Republicans and national Republicans. And he did so in a respectful manner. He didn't certainly condemn the president. He didn't even mention the president by name. But he's had a tough time with some local Republicans. So, you know, I think we're in a spot where somebody like Liz, who part of her living was representing and helping advise Republicans in Connecticut, you know, they need to have Mr. Trump kind of exit the stage and then see what things look like. You know, Connecticut gets caricatured as a blue state, and it is in federal races for president and Congress. But Connecticut really was kind of a purplish state for the General Assembly and gubernatorial elections. It's a very competitive landscape. And the thing you got to remember is, 2008 was a disaster for Republicans when Barack Obama won, and he was really the last president here to have coattail effects. And the Republicans were slammed. I mean, and, earlier we were talking about trying to recognize what's this tectonic shift versus a moment. And in 2008, I was at Chris Shays' campaign headquarters, and I was there when he became, or he ceased to become the last Republican member of Congress from New England. And, remember, Republicans only won 37 state house seats out of 151. And they were really irrelevant. But yet, every 2 years, right through 2016, they climbed back. they did establish an identity separate from national Republicans. It was, social moderation, fiscal conservatism, criticizing the Democrats for their stewardship of the economy and the budget. And, in 2016, it was parity in the Senate, and they came pretty damn close in the House. And then there was Mr. Trump, and it hasn't named since.
Do you, Liz, do you need to establish an entirely different type of Connecticut Republican Party that is just completely separate from the Donald Trump wing of the Republican Party in order for you to be successful?
I think that's impossible to do. I think that I'm not quite sure how you could achieve that, right? We don't live in a vacuum. This isn't, unfortunately, the Truman Show here, right? Like, where I can just pick what happens. The fact is, the Republicans in Connecticut, to Mark's point, have always been the way we are: social, liberal to moderate, fiscal conservatives. Jody Rell was the first governor in the country to advocate and sign legislation that allowed for civil unions for the LGBT community. So, I mean, Chris Shays, Nancy Johnson, Rob Simmons, these are Connecticut Republicans. I think you look at our state legislature and you see those same kinds of Republicans. So the Connecticut Republican Party, it represents itself quite well. I think that particularly looking at 2018, as much as Donald Trump played a role, it was in energizing a Democrat base that, frankly, in Connecticut had not really been energized in a while, right? I mean, you had 8 years of Dan Malloy, and there were a lot of Democrats who were not fond of their Democrat governor. They came out to vote for him, but in his midterm years, he did not fare well in the legislature, to Mark's point. And you had 8 years of a Democrat president. And no matter what, the party in charge in Washington, midterms are very difficult. The only outlier of that in modern political history was George W. Bush in 2002. So there are trends that, to Mark's point, maintain, right? The turnout numbers normalize out of year in some out years. And those sort of habits are pretty cyclical and predictable. And what you saw in 2018 was very similar to what you saw in some of the years during President Obama's tenure, where you had Republicans picking up seats in the legislature. What we weren't able to do was convert that into wins at the congressional or the statewide level. And that could probably take up an entire hour-long podcast in and of itself.
And I may come back to that with you. I just want to actually turn, we've been talking about Republicans, Khalilah, and talk about Democrats right now. There had been a sense for some time, up until recently, I think, in this very, very long, excruciatingly long election cycle, that there is a real divide between a kind of a Bernie, Elizabeth Warren wing of the party and a kind of Joe Biden wing of the party that is more establishment and harkens back to earlier times. Do you see, two questions, do you see that still in evidence in the Democratic Party? And do you feel like the Democrats right now at the national level and really across the board are making a case for being about something that is not just not Trump?
No, I think language is important and labels are important because they often convey a particular perspective. But nationally, I can't tell you what it means to be a progressive, because the definition of that varies based on the person who's responding to the question. Within Connecticut, that same sort of divide or murkiness is also apparent. Think about the police accountability bill that just passed, and no one was happy with the outcome of that. You had a group of people who said, this is horrible. It is going to make the lives of law enforcement officers more dangerous because now it is giving a license to people to do whatever they want. You had people who identify as quote unquote progressive saying, this does not go far enough. I want a more hardline stance. And what we know is that governing is always about the art of compromise. that you have to stand somewhere in order to get closer to what you want, realizing that you can never get everything. And I think that kind of conversation amongst Democrats nationally is also playing out in the state of Connecticut. To think about what we have seen in this state in the wake of COVID-19, the ways in which the disparities around COVID-19 contraction and also mortality has been heavily vested within Black and Brown communities across our state. What will that mean in connection to the national election? What will that mean if people don't have access to healthcare and to health coverage? Families who are already struggling in this sort of economic downturns, now worried about, will I be able to get the healthcare that I need? Will I be able to pay for the prescriptions that I need? Will my kid be able to go to school and have some sense of normalcy there to know that their safety is also protected? And I don't think there is enough of a conversation beyond party elite to actually connect on the ground. And that's something that we see nationally and also within the state across political parties. But I think in this year, where so many people who started this year feeling okay are now realizing in October that they're not as secure as they thought, when you see 40% of Black-owned businesses permanently closing, that raises the question of what the role of government should be beyond our sort of narrow definition of what a conservative approach is to government. It really is about all people deciding what's going to happen next.
You know, when Khalilah talks about the police accountability bill, I was struck, I was reminded of something. And it's easy to a degree to win an election. You know, you get the votes, it's over. It's easy to pass a bill and it's over. But what's hard is what happens after that. And what I'm talking about with the police accountability bill, there was a moment that I fear was lost. And that moment was, for the first time in my career, seeing police officers stand shoulder to shoulder with protesters, not everywhere, but boy, in a lot of places in Connecticut. And then the police accountability bill became about qualified immunity, which is it's a legalistic thing. I really fear that people on both sides have kind of misconstrued the importance of that. It was vital to the advocates to have a limit on qualified immunity for police officers, and it was vital for the police officers to fight that and maintain the status quo there. But to me, the success or failure of that police accountability measure is going to be really a cultural change. You know, it's going to be, will there be a difference in how police officers are trained? What will be the techniques on de-escalating? You know, the Breonna Taylor episode where a woman was shot to death in her apartment, something that probably was fated, you know, once the police made, you know, the really ill-considered decision to do a raid in the middle of the night for a low-level, going after a low-level drug dealer. This was not trying to capture a terrorist who's going to, you know, blow up a school. But so anyway, I think of the police accountability bill in the same way I think of the election. I'm wondering what happens when somebody wins. Then what happens? Do we come back together? Is there some kind of healing? And again, I keep going back to kind of culture, because I've seen ugliness this cycle that I have never seen before in my 40 years of being a reporter, most of it in Connecticut. Of just seeing casual disrespect. You know, when I'm interviewing somebody in Ridgefield the other day and people are walking by giving this guy the finger, or in Farmington Valley, where I was told earlier today that, you know, somebody was hanging a sex toy on the lawn sign of a woman running for the General Assembly. You know, this is a little different place that we're in. The level of anger is real. It's not just on social media. And so the question to me is, after this election, how can the leaders of both parties turn down the temperature and kind of make things work again.
And Liz, I'd like to actually put that to you. And, Mark was talking about things that were happening in real life for the most part, but we've also seen these episodes of Zoom bombing, a Johanna Hayes event, a first congressional district debate the other night. It happened to a candidate in Delaware. This stuff is happening all the time. And I don't know, Liz, we say this every single cycle. It's gotten uglier than it's ever gotten before, but it's really gotten uglier than it's ever gotten before this year.
Well, I think some of that, to Mark's point, is really cultural. I think I talk with candidates and former elected officials all the time. I know I have been a victim of this constantly. And I think we have keyboard warriors who feel like there is a fair amount of distance between them and the person they are attacking. And that empowers people to say and do things they would not do in person. And that is not good for society. That's not good for humanity. That's not good for politics. But mostly, just as people, we need to do better. And so I think I have this conversation. I'll invoke his name. I'm sure he won't mind. I have this conversation with John McKinney often. And we talk about some of the things that he went through after the bill, the gun bill that they passed after the tragedy at Sandy Hook, and some of the things that were said and done to him. And we talk about his dad, who some of you may know was a member of Congress a very long time ago, and some of the horrible things that were said to him and about him, and messages received then, and talking with members of Congress and elected officials on all sides of the aisle. This is something that people, it's just sort of par for the course, comes with the territory, unfortunately. But I do think that social media in particular has empowered people in a way that there is a distance between them and the person that they are attacking in a way that they feel it's okay. And that it is not okay.
But how much of it is emboldened by the guy who's in the White House right now? I mean, there's no one who does this in terms of name calling, baseless accusations, saying things that aren't true about people, spreading conspiracy theories. The man in the White House does that more than almost anybody in America, and he sets a bit of a tone. I mean, does some of that change, Liz, if the resident of the White House changes?
Well, I sure hope it changes, period. If the president gets reelected, that has to change. If the president is not reelected, it has to change. I think that the president has done it in a way that absolutely has added to the problem, not made the problem go away. And he bears a lot of responsibility for that. But I have seen as well, it's sort of emboldened a bipartisan call to action where the rules of decorum that existed maybe when Nancy Johnson was a member of Congress no longer exists. And I do think a lot of that is that we can just pound something out on Twitter and feel good about ourselves and just kind of drop the mic and walk away. And that's a bipartisan problem. And some of the things that I've seen Democrats say on Twitter very much match what the president and Republicans say. As the leader of the free world, he should do better.
Khalilah?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between individual responsibility and institutional accountability here. And, I interviewed the widow of Congressman Elijah Cummings, and she talked about what it meant that her husband was literally fighting for his life and being attacked not only by the president, but by his enablers and his supporters who were wishing death upon him as he was in a fight for his life and still this commitment to democracy. She talked about him having to defend his friendship with Mark Meadows, who at the time was Congressman Mark Meadows, not chief of staff, and making it clear that we are friends. Yes, I'm a part of this party, but we are people. And so that institutional design piece that I think is so important here, Liz, is that there was a break that happened long before Twitter became this cesspool. And that is decision making by people like Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House to say, those bipartisan social gatherings we used to have, we're not going to do that. That idea that to go to the State of the Union of this country that we all love and that we all contribute to, you have to be with your party over here, I'm going to be with my party over here, and we're going to send a clear signal that bipartisanship is viewed as weakness. So that flows in many ways that we see happening across the era, which makes it possible to have a debate, a presidential debate, and you can't hear any policy as 210,000 Americans have lost their lives. And instead we have to figure out how to mute a microphone in order to get substance. That shouldn't be acceptable to anyone, regardless of party. And the concern that I have, to Mark's point, we're going to head into a gubernatorial election in our state. What should we be steeling ourselves for and preparing for in this state as we approach that election? The nastiness, the vitriol, the seeming inability or unwillingness to understand that there are common challenges facing our state, that regardless of how you feel, transportation is an issue. Regardless of how you feel, access to public education, support for small businesses. Can we address those challenges head on without getting into some schoolyard taunts that I wouldn't accept from my kid or my students? And yet we not only accept it from our elected officials, we reward them by paying their salaries to continue doing it. It's like being in an abusive relationship where you don't know why you keep going back, but you go back because it's familiar and there's some kind of security and familiarity.
Professor, you are absolutely right in terms of this has been going on for a long time. And I think it does coincide, and Mark will get a chuckle out of this, I think a lot of it coincides with some of the changes in campaign finance law, where the way in which campaigns are run and financed changed significantly. And so everything had to become partisan because everybody had to get their chance to go raise the money they needed to raise and differentiate themselves. And so I think what you're talking about in terms of the way that Gingrich kind of shifted things to a more partisan, I think that coincided with some significant changes in campaign finance law that changed like entirely the way that Congress behaves. Here's where I'll say, I think Connecticut, for how broken Washington is, and probably unfortunately will be for some time, I am so proud of the way that Connecticut leaders have operated in very difficult spaces, achieving some really monumental outcomes over the course of the last 10 years, let's say, but particularly the last 6 years. When you look at the things that they tackled, things they disagreed on completely opposite sides, they were able to find that common ground. They were able to come together. And to your point earlier, they didn't all agree with the outcome. But boy, did they do some really big things. And one of the things we haven't talked about is the fact that we've got 3 legislative leaders who are retiring this year. And this group of leaders, Themis Klarides, House Republican leader, Len Fasano, Senate Republican leader, Senator Looney, Democrat president, and Joe Arasimowicz, the speaker. So Senator Looney is staying around, but the other 3, this group of people have achieved some really big things. And so I don't expect to see the kind of thing we're seeing at the federal level. You know where you're more likely to see that? In a Republican primary or a Democrat primary if there is one. I think the internal politics will be much more feisty and bitter than we'll see in a general election, because Connecticut voters do not tolerate that and have not tolerated that here in Connecticut. Do they tolerate it at the national level because it's part of, unfortunately, how broken Washington is? Yes. But I think here in Connecticut, we have a reason to be very proud of the way that the leaders of both parties have comported themselves during their tenure in the legislature and what that's done for our state.
Mark, I'm wondering if you can pick up on that a little bit. Our friend Diane Smith wants us to dive into the Connecticut legislature and maybe some interesting races that are there. As Liz points out, there's going to be changes in leadership, certainly. it's fairly clear that the Connecticut legislature isn't changing from Democrat to Republican this time around. But what should we be watching for on election night?
So depending on how big the blue wave is, I mean, if there truly is this tidal wave, then doing granular analysis district by district will be less important. But, you know, so a couple of things to think about. In the state Senate, we had a whole bunch of close races last time. There were, I think it's 9 senators who won with no more than 52% of the vote. One of the things that I'm struck by this year is a huge number of rematches. You have people who came close in 2018. And in a lot of ways, this election is a continuation of 2018. You know, the Democratic base was energized by the president, by the Women's March, by subsequent events on police brutality. It all seems to be part of really one giant campaign since 2018, and there are a lot of candidates trying to, you know, write the finale to a story that they opened up in 2018. So that's something to look for, is again all the rematches, and some were in very close races. You know, there's a Democratic state rep, Maria Horn, up towards your way, John, in Northwest Connecticut, and she unseated a kind of a moderate Republican named Brian Oler. And there was a recount. That's how close it was. Well, Brian Oler is running again against Maria Horn. So, you know, that's something that'll be on my list election night.
I just want to point out that if you drive through the beautiful scenic town of Norfolk, which is lovely this time of year with the changing leaves, there is an Oler or Horn sign in every single yard, save for one. There's a few folks who've decided to put out Rick Astley signs. Rick Astley, of course, the 1980s singer, famous for he's never going to give you up. He's never going to let you down. He's never going to turn around. He's never going to make you cry. Never going to say goodbye. So I'm sad
you're not singing. I'm sad you're not singing.
I've driven through town several times now in the last couple of days, looking for the Rick Astley signs amid the Oler and Horn signs. I apologize for interrupting your astute political analysis for that anecdote, but I just thought that it was important, and maybe we'll sing later on in the program.
But, you know, and one of the other things to keep in mind is the people who are most vulnerable in either party, they tend to be in the districts or swing districts. So these tend to be the people who are a little bit closer to the center. You know, the Democrat would be left of center, but not that far away from the center. And that is one of the things that people in both parties will quietly, if not privately, bemoan, is who on the other side they might beat. Because, you know, one of the little secrets, it's not a secret to Liz or Khalilah or you, is, you know, Ned Lamont doesn't much want to see 26 Democrats elected to the state Senate on November 3rd. You know, 22 would be fine, which I have now. He doesn't want to lose anything. But the more you have, the more complicated his life gets, the more complicated Marty Looney's life gets, because it becomes harder to manage a caucus when you have, you know, in the case of the Senate, anything above 18, you know, is extra. And, you know, people get to do their own thing. And you get a lot of pressures, you know. When the Republicans got greater numbers, they had a fairly vocal group of people far more conservative than the bulk of the Republican caucus. And Larry Cafaro, before Themis Clartis, had to deal with that. And then Themis had to deal with that. And of course, life got simpler for Themis when their numbers went down. So, you know,
I'm not sure she would agree with that.
Well, no, you're right. But that's one of the hard things about these big wave elections. You know, whichever way it goes, you tend to lose people who are what, Liz was talking about, people who are the workers who, yeah, they're partisan, but they're partisan on this issue, but they're going to work with the other side on that issue. The recent energy bill was an example. You had the two Democratic co-chairs of the Energy and Technology Committee working with the two Republican ranking members. And the Democratic co-chairs made it clear that they had the votes with Democrats to probably go a little bit further than some of the Republicans would have been comfortable with. But they thought it very important to say, no, this is a bipartisan effort. Energy policy, particularly when it came to the reliability and cost, should not be partisan. You get into climate change, okay, it's a little bit of a different animal. So that's sort of I guess, one of the concerning things. If we have a huge wave, will it become harder for the parties to work together, as opposed to when it was 18-18 in the Senate? And, you've got people on both sides who say the budget they put together in 2017 had a lot of smart things in there. Volatility cap. It kind of made sure that if you were running big surpluses, you weren't gonna spend it. You were going to use it to pay down pension debt, stuff like that. So it's a little bit hard to kind of maintain that balance. And particularly this year, I don't think we're going to see much of a balance on November 3rd.
I want to get to a couple of questions that people are putting in here. Mark Gilbert has written a question that I love, and it's fairly detailed for an event like this, but I'll read it. It says, given the intersection of this pandemic, struggling economy, disintegration of social support systems, and racial injustice exposed beyond argument, what are the issues you think we should first pursue that will have the best chance of finding success in Connecticut? What specific structural changes do you think need immediate attention? Wow. It's a big question. And because it's such a big question, I want to put it to you, Khalilah Brown-Dean.
Thanks.
Let the professor handle that one.
Yeah. I was just thinking that actually my students have an exam next week. So Mark, if you could come write an exam question for me, or just let me capture this one, I'll be sure to give you full credit for that. Thank you so much.
I like he even has A and B. It's almost like, C and D, like none of the above.
I think Mark's an educator. I love it.
But I mean, well, to that point, I mean, but he's asking, I think, a very important question. I mean, when we think about a time like this, I mean, what are the things that we actually need to try to fix, and what are the things that if we were to try to fix them, they would actually have some resonance right now? I mean, that is a hard thing to think about, because there's so much in this world that seems so very, very broken.
And often it feels like those two things are in conflict with one another, what we should be doing and what we can do in an expedient way. Based on the first part of the question, I am very laser focused about the investments that we are making in young people in our state. One of the things that COVID-19 revealed is the fractures in our system of public education across our state. So that some people thought that, well, let's keep people safe by moving to Zoom or moving to Google Classroom. That sounds great, but that requires that you have stable, consistent internet access in your home. It requires that you have the equipment that you will need in order to engage. It also assumes that there's a parent who can be there with you to help walk you through that. And we also realized this year that, unfortunately, for many children, home is not a safe place for them to be. And so it raises these broader questions about what are the investments and commitments we need to make into education that will require a structural change when it comes to funding, when it comes to the types of opportunities that young people have. And John, I think that feeds into every other policy area and challenge that we are facing in Connecticut. You want to have a police force and a law enforcement system that looks like the community that it protects and looks like the community that it serves. Well, you have to cultivate a pipeline early on so that people see public safety as a career that they want to be a part of, or that if there are changes that they want to make, they need to be a part of that and set up very early on to do that. So what are the kinds of vocational training programs we have in our schools to do that? How are we pursuing entrepreneurship for young people so that they can create the small businesses that will drive the economy of our state? And at a very basic level, it's hard for a kid to pay attention in a virtual classroom when they are uncertain about whether their family will be able to stay in their home the next month or the month after that, or if going back to school in person is better for their social emotional health, but then puts another family member at risk, because we are now seeing an increase in multi-generational family units in order to consolidate costs. So I think that's where we need to focus. What are the opportunities we need to create for young people? And most importantly, how do we listen to what young people are saying? If all of us as adults are feeling the stress and the anxiety and the heaviness of this year, whether it's election or COVID or racial reckonings, then certainly young people are feeling it magnified.
Mm. I think, Liz, Khalilah touches on one of the many things I think that we're probably learning from this year, right? We're seeing all sorts of systems that some people thought were working, a lot of people thought weren't working, and they're just exposed, right? It's very clear that something in our education system is fundamentally wrong when we can't educate kids through a pandemic, and that's just one of many examples. What are some things to our viewers' question there that you think we need to focus on coming out of all this as we get through this very important election?
Well, I want to echo what the professor said in terms of what has been exposed, right? I mean, 1 in 4 Connecticut students lost learning during the pandemic for all of the reasons the professor mentions, right? I mean, this has been, as a working parent with 2 young kids, this has been very difficult for everybody. And so I think that Connecticut started this in a space where we have consistently had one of the worst achievement gaps in the country. And there is just no excuse for that. And I think what I would love to see again is having a more bipartisan dialogue about the solutions, because to your point, Mark, about some of the unsexy things that were in that 2017 budget that have made a fundamental structural change in the way that we govern as a state. I think if we can get those kinds of outcomes on the issues that Mark is talking about, boy, will we really fundamentally change things here, right? I mean, we need better opportunities for people in education. We need a better way to provide support and opportunity to the business community, particularly small businesses who have been so disadvantaged by what's happened during the pandemic. So I think that all of it needs to be fixed, and I think it all works together. You can't have a strong economy if you don't have an educated population. You can't employ people who are not ready for the workforce. And so you really can't just pick one of them as a priority. You really have to tackle all of them. And I think we are in a better position to tackle these things because of the bipartisan work that was done in previous budget cycles that put us in a position to where we are financially stronger than we would otherwise be. And again, I would say the call to action here is for the new group of bipartisan leaders to get their heads together and work to tackle these problems, because we know we can fix them if they work together.
One of the least sexy things that's going on right now is this Governor Lamont's administration, before the pandemic, started paying some real attention to, again, the really boring area of workforce development. And this sort of builds on what Khalilah was talking about, what's going on in the schools. And, Governor Malloy sort of started the effort to trying to connect job training to actual jobs. And this is something that's hugely important because, you have to remember in Connecticut that 40% of the state is really vulnerable, that they're either under the poverty level or they're on the bubble. They don't have enough money in the bank to deal with an unexpected expense of like more than $400 or $500 bucks. And the pandemic has been this huge stress test about that. But before the pandemic, you know, people would be surprised to learn that one of Connecticut's problems in being slow in growing jobs is that there were like 10,000 manufacturing jobs going wanting. You know, these were jobs that pay a middle class salary. And, you know, so before the pandemic, you know, I mean, I was working on a story then, and I'm now revisiting it, updating it, but about the extent to which Connecticut is preparing people for the jobs that are there, and also the extent to which they are reaching down into the element of the workforce that, and I don't say this to put anybody down, but it's sort of the marginal end. It's the people who are doing maybe 2 part-time jobs to eke out a living, but they don't have benefits. You know, maybe they're at minimum wage or slightly above minimum wage. And that's a big chunk of Connecticut that's vulnerable. So this doesn't require a lot of legislative action, but it would be nice if people would wake up to this issue and get behind, to do the hard work of making sure that we take these job training programs, some of which are very successful. They're very good at actually placing people and knitting it together into a system that works. And, you know, that's been something that's, you know, sort of went on the back burner during the pandemic, but they're starting to step that up again. But that's going to be one of the things that will determine if Connecticut really turns the corner in a way that has any sustainability, not just for the well-to-do, but for how to bring more people into the middle class and give them a stable earning.
We just have a couple minutes left, and I want to ask Khalilah Brown-Dean quickly about something that I probably heard from voters as I've done some national radio programs over the course of the last several months. I've talked to pollster Stan Greenberg on my podcast, who talks to voters who say that they're unsure who they're voting for, which I never really believe. And everyone talks to says that healthcare is the thing that is most on people's minds, because we've never fixed the problem of providing healthcare in America to people. We've maybe given more people health insurance than they had before, but that hasn't solved the problem. And then as we go through a health pandemic, it really comes to the forefront that our healthcare system is broken. Is healthcare the thing to you, Khalilah Brown-Dean, that's most on the table right now in this election, or that needs to be addressed nationwide more than anything else?
I'm always hesitant to say the issue, but I think it is definitely in the top 2. And here's why. Healthcare, as you said, has to be more than just health insurance and health coverage. Care also includes looking at total holistic health and wellness. It looks at prevention. It looks at access that people have, access to care, access to counseling and behavioral health services that can help people make it through these kinds of challenging times. And I think that in a system and in a place where you have people who had good jobs, who, did all the things they were supposed to do, and we're still finding a difficult time getting access to testing or getting access to treatment. And as we know from cases here in Connecticut, people who went to get treatment and were turned away and sadly lost their lives because of that. That is something that, again, I don't think we should politicize, because people are struggling in Montana just as they are struggling in the Commonwealth of Kentucky to keep themselves healthy and safe. And on the cusp of a major vote to appoint someone to the United States Supreme Court, and the implications of that for the very fragile measures that we do have in place to at least create some kind of coverage and access, this issue is not going away.
A last thing for you, Liz, to get back to something that we touched on earlier. We mentioned this idea of the role of government and what it could or should be. And I guess I wonder if you feel like that's one of the things that's on the table this election, because I grew up with a worldview of Republicans and Democrats that thought about what the role of government should be I think in kind of a little bit of a black and white way. And that seems to have been, let's just say, muddied by this year of COVID, in which governmental intervention is incredibly important to people's lives. And I guess I'm wondering if that's something that you feel the different approaches to what role government plays is something that we're really going to be thinking about this election.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think it plays off of the conversation about what are the priorities. And while Stan might be correct at the federal level, here in Connecticut, we like living here. Generally speaking, our quality of life is very good, but we lack affordability. And that's true across the board. And that creates a lot of problems in terms of talking about the role of government. From what I've seen, I think people in Connecticut are not looking for a government to try and make things more complicated, right? When they're talking about how are we going to empower parents to better educate their children and to make the choices that work for them and their families, we're talking about less government intervention. When we're talking about empowering small businesses and letting entrepreneurs create a space that allows them to succeed, we're talking about less government intervention, not more. I think that in terms of the response to the pandemic, certainly things like PPE and testing and protecting particularly those most vulnerable to us, and identifying trends like where we started this conversation, where the professor was talking about the fact that our Black and Brown communities have been so disproportionately affected by this pandemic in particular. How are we going to address those issues in our vulnerable populations? That is the role of government, and I think that's what people are going to be looking for. But in terms of the recovery and reopening and where do we go from here, I think politicians are not necessarily the most trusted group of people in terms of finding ways to fix things. I think that people feel they are much better at controlling their own destiny and their own outcome. So that might be a very traditionally Republican answer for you, but that's probably the lane that I would stay in, because I think people are going to make better decisions, but it's the role of government particularly, I think, to identify those who have been adversely affected by this, and how do we help them, and how do we stop them from being impacted by things like this in the future.
Paz, the last question for you comes from one of our viewers here, who says, does our panel see President Trump's effort to appeal to suburban voters by warning the Democrats want, quote, low-income housing invading their towns? They see that striking a chord in Connecticut.
I've looked for evidence of it, and it's hard to say. It's something that, in my business, you look for issues that fit into an existing narrative, because those are the arguments that tend to have power. If they're striking something that people are leaning that way, and in New England, in Connecticut, local rule is huge. And, Marty Looney, the leader of the Senate, when he pushed sort of a school regionalization bill, and it was a lot of carrots and looking at some of these smaller systems, politically, I mean, that was just a really bad door to open. And they're kind of paying for that in concert with, police accountability. And again, generally speaking, affordable housing. Connecticut has a great degree of segregation. This is a bad thing to bring up in the last minutes of a discussion, but there's no question Connecticut has, in many communities, restrictive zoning, 2-acre zoning, and there's also an issue of cost. Even if you wave a magic wand and you allow multifamily housing in a lot of these suburbs in Fairfield County that don't currently allow it, you're still up against some of the most expensive real estate in the United States. So, I mean, that's a longer conversation. But, Yeah, it is grabbing some attention. I'll be honest, I have no idea how to weigh that against the true anger in the suburbs, particularly women towards the president who is very verbally abusive to his opponents, particularly women. There's a lot of there's data. There's a lot of polling there. There's a gargantuan gender gap. There's always been a gender gap. Republican, women, leaning a little bit more towards Democrats, but now it's huge because of this president, who not only wants to tell you that Kamala Harris has bad politics, but that she's also a monster. That has not played well. So I guess the question for that person is, which one tilts the balance? Is it concern about, affordable housing, or is it concern about the president? The interesting thing is, you see Black Lives Matter signs all over the suburbs. Now, my colleague Jackie Ray Thomas had a story where there was one of these sort of demonstrations, Black Lives Matter, and there was a Black gentleman who lived in one of the suburbs who said, yeah, they're all with us on Black Lives Matter and police stuff, but let's talk about zoning, and it's going to be a different talk. So
there's plenty of Jacqueline Rabe Thomas stories to go through with anecdotes just like that one. I know that's a hard question to ask as the last question, but we ran out of time. I mean, we only had so much time. It's not like the radio. I mean, they didn't shut off at 8 o'clock, but I went a couple minutes over. I want to thank you all very much for doing this. I want to thank our audience. I want to thank Khalilah Brown-Dean, Associate Professor of Political Science at Quinnipiac University. Her book here, look at this, I got product placement.
Right.
It's called Identity Politics in the United States. And she's got a cool new podcast called Disrupted on Connecticut Public. Khalilah, just give us 30 seconds on Disruptive. What do we hear?
So you will hear conversations with Black law enforcement officers in Connecticut about what it means to be Black and blue in this time. You'll hear about the role of art in promoting social change. And next week, you will hear about how we manage the stress of elections and promote better health. So thank you, John, for having me, and thank you to the Connecticut Mirror.
We probably should have just spent the entire hour just talking about how we can be more healthy. Maybe we can come back after the election and talk about that.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Liz Kurantowicz is a veteran Republican strategist, and she's got this new political action committee called Fight for Connecticut. Give me 30 seconds on what Fight for Connecticut is, Liz.
Fight for Connecticut is an effort. Our honorary chair is Themis Claridis, who is retiring from the state legislature this year. And the goal is to draw attention to the fact that one-party control of Connecticut leads to sort of one-sided solutions, and we need to be thinking about things in a different way.
Excellent. She's also a regular on WTNH's Capitol Report. Say hi to the Capitol Report gang for me, and thank you so much, Liz, for being here. It's great to see you.
I will. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Connecticut Mirror for having me.
And Mark Pazniokas is the Capitol Bureau Chief, of course, of the Connecticut Mirror. Are you going to watch that ball game, Paz, or you given up on baseball for the year?
I watched a little bit of the first game. I turned on just in time to see Mookie hit a home run, and I have to admit, I cheered for him.
Mookie steals a base. Everyone in America gets a free taco. That was the big story from last night. Thank you all very much for joining us. I know there's a lot of other things going on. We do have another event coming up next week, as I was talking about at the top of the program. Jennifer McFadden of Yale School of Management will be moderating a conversation with Bruce Putterman. He's the publisher of The Mirror. And John Thornton of the American Journalism Project. He has really helped to jumpstart a lot of journalism programs and projects across America, raised some $50 million to invest in local journalism. That is next Wednesday, October 28th at 5:30 p.m. You can go to ctmirror.org/events to sign up for that. And there are a lot more events coming up with the Connecticut Mirror as well. You can always subscribe to our podcast, Steady Habits. Just go to steadyhabits.org. Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.